A couple of you guys suggested in the unboxing video what color and what livery I should go with on this build, which is of course much appreciated, but as I mentioned in that video, this is a commission for a corporate client and I have no say in the color or sheen. They decided on a color and a sheen for the entire build and the other two builds as well. They're all going to be built in the same color and the same sort of design. So this will not be anything that came out of the actual factory from Ford back in the day when they made these racing cars. This will be a bit of a combination on some of the schemes that were actually built and also a bit of imagination from the customer with his vision on what they should look like, of course. Before I could start painting and applying the livery on it, I needed to start on prepping the body, so I marked off all of the mold lines with a permanent marker to see where they are, and of course help as a guide coat when removing them with the sanding sticks and sandpaper. As I'm sanding over the black marker, it slowly starts to disappear, and so does that mold line as well. Before I started sanding and removing those mold lines, I went over all of the panel lines quickly with a Panelline scriber from Tamiya that I made the panel lines a bit deeper with so they wouldn't be buried in paint, and I could then start removing all of those mold lines and sanding them smooth, and also sanding the rest of the body with some 600 grit to make it nice and grippy for the primer to stick to it. With the mold lines removed, the panel lines improved, and the rest of the body sanded smooth, I could move on to priming all of those hard to reach, easy to forget spots, and then of course moving on to the rest of the body with a couple light coats as well. The first coat of primer is on. I let it sit and dry for about 5 minutes. Nothing really major popped up, so I could just easily move on to the second and final coat of primer. The primer went on nice and smooth, so I let it sit and dry for about 10 minutes, removed a couple of small dust spots that fell into it with some 3000 grit sanding sponges, and then carefully started moving on to applying the body color. Of course, the hard to reach, easy to forget spots first, and then the rest of the body was coated in a couple light coats as well. As you can see, the color isn't really covering all that quickly, so I just take my time, 5 minutes in between coats. And in the video I'm showing about 3 coats that I applied. In the end I think it was 5 or 6 to be entirely sure that everything was covered and the color was nice and even all over. With the 3rd coat now applied in the video and the 5th coat actually applied in real life, I let it sit for about 24 hours before I started masking it off. Now normally you could just easily move on to masking pretty quickly, but since I applied 5 color coats and the coats weren't really covering that well, I just took it safely, let it sit for about 24 hours before I started masking it off. And also because I'm masking most of the body off, I'm being extra careful and letting it dry properly instead of just going too quickly and probably ruining it. I firstly laid down a nice line in the center with some masking tape to go off of with the rest of the stripe and the design on the front. Once happy with the center line, I started on the design for the front. I put on a big piece of masking tape and started sketching it out with a pencil. Once I was happy, I pulled out a marker and made that permanent. I later on pulled this piece off to make it onto another piece of masking tape with a clean fresh cut, as I don't really like cutting onto the paint, so I just rather took it off and cut it onto the tape itself and then put it back in place and also mirrored it at the same time, so it could be repeated on the other side as well. With the first side now in place, I mirrored it to the second side as well, and that could be carefully stuck in place too. With the design on the front now laid out, I could move on to the rest of the stripe as well. This was laid out with a piece of masking tape at the beginning to determine the width and also the center point of the body. I could then move on to laying out a piece of masking tape either side, removing that center to reveal the parts that needed to be painted. The rest of the body was of course carefully masked off as well before I started mixing the silver paint to lay down as a nice bright base. The green is quite a dark color and I'm going over it with some yellow stripes, so instead of applying multiple coats and not really getting any coverage or just some weird green fading through it, I decided to lay down this silver base to act as a nice bright and also even base for the yellow to go on top of, making it easier to cover for the yellow and also turning the yellow into a bit of a brighter yellow as the background isn't really that dark. I applied 2 light coats of silver. I just show one as it's pretty much the same for the second coat, of course. In between the coats of silver I let it sit and dry for about 5 minutes, and after the final coat of silver I let it sit for another 5 minutes, cleaned out the airbrush, and moved on to carefully applying the yellow. As you can see, it is covering quite okay over the silver, but I still took it very slow as I don't really want to build up a thick layer of paint around the edges and leave a big fat line when I remove the masking tape, so I'm just taking it very slow and applying it in multiple thin coats. In the end, I think I did about 3 or 4 coats. I'm just showing a couple as it's pretty much looking the same after the second coat is applied in the video. The yellow is quite thin and not really covering all that well, so I let it sit for a bit longer in between before moving on to the second, third, and fourth coat. About 10 minutes in between coats is good enough if you keep applying them very lightly, of course. The second coat of yellow has been applied, 2 more followed, after which I let it sit and dry for about 5 minutes before carefully start removing the masking tape. After the tedious job of removing all of the masking tape, I could move the body back into the spray booth, as it has no overspray whatsoever from the yellow, and I could just easily move on to the clear coat. I'm recently getting a lot of questions on how I do the dust prevention on the body. Well, firstly, before I apply any coat of paint, I just blow over the entire body with air through the airbrush and remove any dust with my fingers that is on the body and won't just blow off, and then of course blow over it again. I decided along with the customer that we weren't really going to go with a glossy clear nor go for a full matte, but just stick somewhere in between, and we went with a nice satin. It's going to look pretty much the same as it did without clear, but then just have a bit of a nicer equal shine all over the body, or equal shine. It's not really a shine, it's more of a sheen, I guess. And I'm just applying it the same I would with some normal clear. You apply it, the way you apply it on is how it will look. In this case, it's starting out glossy, and if it's looking even and glossy all over, it's pretty much good, and it will turn out satin after a couple of minutes. First coat is on and is looking nice and even all over. You can already see some spots dry out and coming to look like the satin. As you can see here, it turned out equally satin all over, and a second coat was nicely applied and did the job. So right after I applied the second coat, you can see the roof is still pretty wet, so is the engine cover as well, and the front is starting to dry out and get to its final sheen along with the side. In the end, it will all turn the same sheen and the glossiness will totally disappear. If you have any orange peel in the clear coat, it will be visible in the final stages of the body, as you can't really polish it out at all. If you do want to remove it, you need to let it dry, resand it, and re-clear it. Reason being, of course, the clear is satin, and if you want to polish something, it will turn into a glossy finish, and the same will happen to that satin clear coat. If you polish it, it will become glossy.